Richard Rouse, welcome to the Game Informer Show, sir.
Hey, good to be here. Good to be here.
Yeah, it's an honor to have you. So last time we, or at least myself personally, worked a lot with you was on a cover story for Rainbow Six Patriots. You're the narrative designer or narrative director on that one?
Yeah, I was the narrative director on that game for a couple of years.
Couple rough years, couple tough years, I'd imagine. But what?
Yeah, it was an interesting. It's funny when I talk about that. I say it was 75% a really good experience.
That's a good way to frame it. Just really focus on that.
Yeah.
Well, I'd love to talk about it a little bit later, but just since the Rainbow Six Patriots days, what have you been up to? What's your life been like?
Well, after being at Ubisoft for a couple of years, we wanted to move back to the U.S., so I moved out to the Seattle area and worked at Microsoft for a couple of years. So there, I was in their sort of publishing group, so I would help out a bunch of different projects and do, everything from just reviewing their builds and giving them feedback to also like doing prototypes for them and stuff like that. So I worked on some things that never saw the light of day, but also worked on Sunset Overdrive's multiplayer for a bit. Worked on Quantum Break's Serene Junctions for a while, and probably spent the most time on State of Decay, the zombie survival game, which was, I liked everything I worked on there, but that game was the most in my wheelhouse, I felt. So I really liked working on that. With
and you focus on you focus on the Lifeline DLC, right?
Yeah, no, I came on right sort of as it was shipping the original game. So they were already had the Breakdown DLC, which was the first DLC in the pipe. So worked on that a bit, and then worked on Lifeline, and then worked on what has now been announced as State of Decay 2. So. Oh,
really? The early days of that?
Yeah. No, that started right way back then. I mean, I don't know how official that statement is by me, given I've been gone from there for a few years now. But yeah, no, early days on that and just all the things they want. I mean, the Undead Labs guys were always very open about, what they wanted to do in the future with their games. So right from the jump, we knew they wanted to do more. And we were super pleased with how well it had done. Coming out as sort of an Xbox 360 XBLA title at the end of XBLA as we know it, or as we knew it, and doing as well as it did, because it was, the biggest selling game on that. I think it was the biggest selling game on that service other than Minecraft. And that was a surprise to everyone, given how late in the cycle it was.
Yeah, I mean, everybody talks about the game's problems. Obviously, is a little bit janky out of the gate. It still is just lovably janky, but there's so much potential there. Was that the most exciting project you worked on at your time at Microsoft, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of what I like to play, it definitely was. I agree that, and I think they would agree that it's not like The Last of Us or something where it's all about a super polished, very specific experience. It's about a really broad experience with a lot of different things you can do and a lot of different ways you can choose to spend your time and different, experiences you can have that are more emergent than what you get in like a Last of Us. 'Cause I remember the first game came out right at the same time as The Last of Us, and there were some interesting comparison reviews between the two. Obviously, that was a PlayStation exclusive, and State of Decay was an Xbox exclusive, so that helped separate it a little bit. But it was also just such a, the same sort of fictional world of zombies and stuff, but just utterly different takes on what to do with that.
Yeah.
So,
what's it like to be a narrative guy thrown into a game that's celebrated for its emergent qualities?
No, I mean, I've always been a mix of game design and writing. Going all the way back to my first projects. Just I've always enjoyed that space where the game design and the writing work really together and inform each other, and you're designing things that'll help you tell a story, and then you're choosing a story that'll help the game mechanics work. So I've always seen them as one and the same. I haven't been the guy, I think that Rainbow Six project was the only one where I was, strictly a narrative guy.
Okay.
Almost every other job I've had, I've been a game designer or creative director or whatever. So, yeah, so I'm someone who, my dreams of narrative are not about, I want to get across this one story. It's more about, I want players to get into a world and poke around at it and contribute to the authorship of whatever the story is that comes out of it, right? That it's, you're giving, so that you've maybe heard that term abdicating authorship, that you're giving some of the authorship over to the player about what they choose to do. And the game doesn't really, the game narrative doesn't really exist until they play and do what they're going to do.
Yeah.
More so than, any other medium, obviously. Obviously, when you go to a film, you bring your own, interpretation of the characters and your own baggage and whatever that helps you have an experience with a film or something. But in a game, you're obviously doing a lot more than that. And I just like, I do like games that have a very fixed story as well, but my favorite ones are ones that leave a lot of room for the player to both interpret it and make choices about what they're going to do, and then see what the ramifications of those choices are. So something like State of Decay was great for that, because it had a very fixed narrative at its core, but then had all these side things you could do, missions that would be very, emotionally resonant because of the gameplay that would happen with them. The one we always talked about was there was a mission sort of after you'd been playing the game for a long time. There was a mission that sent you back to where the tutorial was, basically, with the beginning, where you're going back to find, I think it's Lily's dad's watch or something that's left behind at the ranger station. And that was the story that just came up over and over again when players would talk about it. It's like, oh, well, I had to get Lily's watch because Lily's been helping me for 20 levels. And it's like, there's no cutscenes, involved in this. There's no big, you can not do it. Doesn't really impact the larger story, but it's super hard. It sends, and I think it works for several reasons. It sends you back to where the game started, which you haven't been to in a long time because you've been in sort of the main open world instead of the like narrow pipe that's the tutorial.
Yeah.
Sends you back there and you're like, oh yeah, I remember this. That was a long time ago. And so you have all those sort of feelings as a player. And then you're like, oh, I'm going to go get that watch. Wow, that's the most Zeds I've ever seen, right? Because the place is like infested. And you're like, no, I'm going to do it. And people die there. People lose multiple characters trying to get that watch back because, it's permadeath and you lose characters one by one, but you've still got your community. And I lost that time. This time I'm going to get it. And it's a nice little open play space where it is that all sorts of different solutions can happen about how you finally get it.
State of Decay was interesting.
That's interesting how that little mission, it was actually way less time probably than like all the more scripted stuff they did for narrative, is the one that resonated the most with players. And that's what's fascinating to me about it.
It really is. Like, thinking about what resonates with players, I think State of Decay is a really interesting example, because there's the base game, which is kind of a nice mix of two. And then it seemed like the Breakdown DLC was just going all in on the emergent crowd. Like, hey, it's just survival. If you just want that experience, you don't want to mess around with the story, go for it. Then Lifeline, you guys tried to steer a little bit more towards narrative-based. At the end of that experiment, were there any conclusions about, like, I think this worked better than we thought? I mean, with those two, test pools of DLCs, like, which one do you think rose to the top?
Yeah, I mean, I can only say, I've talked to the Undead guys about it a little bit, and I was leaving Microsoft right around when the Lifeline one was shipping. But, personally to me, I was more into the Breakdown experience just because, after you've played the game a long time, it's more of a pure survival thing and you level your guys up and it's more challenging and stuff. Lifeline to me was a really interesting attempt to say, what if this was in a more urban environment? What if this was more about guns? What if there was more time pressure? So it had a lot of sort of interesting experiments in it. And I like that it was showing like the military point of view versus just the survivor point of view. Because in the main game, the military is more like they're up to something and you don't quite trust them, right? So it's always cool. I always like seeing, other people's point of view to be like, oh, they have reasons for doing what they're doing, right? So I think all that was super fascinating. But for me, if I go back to the game, what I want to play is Breakdown. So.
Yeah, definitely same here. So, I mean, being on that publisher crack team group, we never really hear too much from that perspective. What is that like? Is it stressful? Is it educational, just to jump from project to project? I mean, you're just the SEAL Team 6 for game design, right? Is that how that works?
Yeah, I mean, maybe SEAL Team 4 or something.
Okay, perfect.
No,
SEAL Team Xbox One, yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely, at Microsoft back then anyway, certainly these things evolve over time, but the philosophy was, trying to just empower the team that we were working with to do the best thing possible. So it wasn't about us doing the press or whatever. It was more, hey, how can we, help a team that's already good, maybe do something weird with the Xbox that they wouldn't know how to do otherwise, that we can talk to our ATG group about doing some cool new thing, or how can we just be someone, because often when you're working with a publisher, a non-Microsoft publisher, the feedback you're getting is from like producer type people or business type people or marketing type people. So Microsoft wanted to have design, sort of creative direction represented as sort of a separate discipline in the publishing group, so that we were giving feedback purely on creative stuff and less worried about obviously we were still part of the conversation of this has to ship and here's how many features we can do and how many we can't. But it was more, just fighting for the creative end of it. Because often, when you have one person trying to do both the business side and the creative side, like one's usually dominant and then ends up winning all those fights. So having two like really strong personalities who could, push back and forth on each other and try to just make the overall game better and still profitable. That was sort of an interesting dynamic and something not a lot of publishers do. So that was cool.
How do you not just come across as the man in that situation? I mean, when you're working with these really tight development teams, especially, somebody like Remedy, where it's a great team, but they've been working together for so long, and it's like, hey, here comes Mr. Microsoft. How do you push through that barrier? You just bringing them out for beers every once in a while, or how do you fix that?
Yeah, definitely meeting them on site is important. And, building a relationship where they can meet you and see, because they're used to, when the publisher comes, it's this type of people or whatever. And they're going to make me do X, Y, and Z, or they're going to tell me I have to, cut things or whatever. And when you wouldn't be able to meet them and spend time with them, like on, if you're not meeting them in person all the time, maybe you're Skyping with them regularly or whatever. Just being able to say like, hey, I'm really worried about the creative. And it helps. Usually these people who succeeded in this jobs had a track record of, I worked on these 5 games in your shoes, right? I've been, on the other side most of the time, and I've just come over to do this publishing thing now. And they can say, I get it. You understand our problems more than someone who's only been in publishing or something.
Right, right.
So that was key. And then usually there would be a couple of things they really wanted, and they were maybe getting pushback from their own team on or their own management or from the producer side. And if you could say, hey, that is a cool thing, let me go fight for that for you with whoever, and then get them a few of those wins, right, to talk in management speak, they would say, oh, wow, this guy can really help me out when I need it. And then they start, trusting you more and stuff like that. But it definitely takes time, and it doesn't happen every time either. Like not every project, ever crosses that where they actually trust you standpoint. And that's, fine. It is still business, and they are still making the game in their studio. So that's ultimately their responsibility.
Yeah.
More than it's mine.
Were you working with Casey Hudson then? Was he part of that group now for Mass Effect fame?
Oh, I think he came in after I had left.
Okay.
He's working at Microsoft now. Is that right?
I think so. Yeah. It's the creative director, ambiguous creative director.
Time that he came in.
Okay.
But there was like Joe Staten was in my group.
Oh my God.
From Halo fame.
Yeah.
Back in the day. So he was in sort of doing overall narrative, and he came in towards the end of my time there, and we went out and had lunch and
he worked on Recore
State of Decay stuff. And
that's awesome. Who struck you from your time at Microsoft working with so many talented developers and individuals? Like, did any teams really stand out, or any specific developers kind of blow your mind in terms of like, I never knew that this team or this person was this talented?
Yeah, certainly when you talk about Insomniac and Remedy and, Undead Labs, those are all very different teams with very interesting makeups and all very impressive in their own ways. And it's interesting, the longer you do this game development thing and you go from team to team, you always think you're going to find the people who have it all figured out. Like this team knows what they're doing. They're a bunch of ninjas, no question. They don't need any help. And I find that never happens. And even the teams that are highly functioning, right, that are shipping great games consistently, are still like in development hell for long periods of time where they're like lost and don't know what's going on, and like are moving people around on their team to try to solve problems and stuff like that. So it's rare to find people who have all the answers. So there was a team I worked with briefly at Zen Studios, the guys who make pinball effects stuff. And then I worked on a game called Castle Storm, which was a lot of fun. It's this little, sort of looked like a mobile game, but actually originally came out on XBLA as well, like a, Angry Birds crossed with like tower defense crossed with, and it's a pretty cool little game, like a nice little digital title sort of thing. And they were just that team was really sharp. And they're off in, oh God, I'm going to get this wrong, Romania, I want to say. I'm getting it wrong. Maybe Budapest? No, they're in Budapest. They're in Hungary. Sorry. And they're just, off in their corner of the world doing their thing, and you don't hear of them as this great, but they were just super sharp team. And I would give them feedback and we'd talk about things, and they wouldn't do everything I suggested. But when I said, hey, we should do a different level that's like this, it'd be like 3 days later, here it is, what do you think? They were just very open to getting that and trying different stuff. So
what do you think that
I'm
is?
very just fast to turn it around.
Is it just that they've cranked out so many pinball tables, so many pinball games, they're just used to like just going through the entire phase of production and sealing it off and just doing that again and again and again, where they've just honed it down more than other teams have?
Yeah, and I think they were, a little less, certain that they had it all sorted out on their end. So when someone new came in, and I played through the whole game, which I think usually working with publishers, you'll find someone like they only play the first level or something like that, because they literally, like someone who's just got a producer hat on, all they have time to do is track all the money stuff they're tracking and the scheduling stuff, and then check out your game in their spare time, right? Whereas I had a bigger chunk of time to really play it. And often when you say, hey, I was on level 5 and I tried this and then this happened, that's another thing that gets the developer to really sort of respect you. They're like, oh, you're really putting the time in with my game. This is awesome. Particularly if you establish that you are, experienced designer as well, and you're going to look at things more analytically. Because that's a rare resource. Often when you're on these giant teams like at Ubisoft or whatever, who has time to play the game for like 5 hours, right? Like, because what do you really need to do to find out if something's working or not? Sometimes is play the whole thing. But if everyone is busy with their tasks and everyone is busy making a build for a review or whatever, you're often dropping in and playing for 15 minutes and doing some little thing and then jumping out again. And if you do have people playing it for long periods of time, they're quality assurance folks who are great, but also aren't, experienced designers themselves typically. So it's great to sometimes just have someone who's got the time to put it into your game, and good stuff can come out of that. And I think the Zen guys reacted well to that. So
yeah, I'm wondering if there are any other big lessons that you learned as the keys to success. Pull somebody off, have them play the game more, just embrace the chaos. Like, what are the other big thematic lessons you learned throughout all these examples?
Yeah, definitely always remember to play your game. I think Peter Molyneux has talked about that as well, that, when you're crunching, it's just hard. You lose sight of, what you're even doing, and you don't stop and just say, let's just play what we have and see where it is. I guess the other thing I've learned, like that Zen example of like, I would throw out an idea and they'd just try it right away instead of having a long debate about whether we should try it first. Obviously, they wouldn't do something that they thought was a complete waste of time, but often it's like, hey, we've got a problem. Everyone knows there's a problem. Instead of like debating and writing a bunch of documents about what we should do about it and maybe we should just try some stuff really quickly. And if you have tools and engine that's set up to do that in a quick turnaround in your pipeline and stuff, you can really just say, what if we did this? What if we did this? And then just know that you're going to throw out 50% of these things that you try, but then some of them will be like, yes, that there. And then you can go back and properly engineer it and properly scope it for the project. But I've seen a lot of teams get stuck in an analysis paralysis state of just not knowing there's problems, but not also trying things to fix them fast enough.
And that's just leadership then?
And is that because of leadership?
Is that what it needs? Just a strong leader to put a vision on a board and say, run towards this?
I think a strong leader is part of it, but it's really a company culture thing of teams. Some teams are just, able to just try stuff and know that failure is okay. Other teams, everyone's more worried about, well, I don't want to look bad, so I can't try the thing that I don't think is going to look good, or I don't want to try to make that piece of art that I think is wrong because I don't, they're just more guarded about what they're doing. And then that breeds a culture of everyone being like that. But I think if you have a company culture, because it often, it's the interesting looking at studios, it's pretty rare for a studio to change radically, to go from making, lower scoring games to like really high scoring games or something like that. Sometimes they may have been making a really good experience, but not having the budget to like make it look pretty or something like that.
Right.
And you can solve that kind of problem. But it's rare to say, wow, they weren't making fun stuff before, but if we just give them these 3 tips now, they will be. It's more like they've got to have that internal DNA there, and no one leader or no one person is often going to change that, particularly on those bigger teams.
Yeah, for sure. So what was life after Microsoft like?
Yeah, so then after Microsoft, I launched into my current indie venture, which is making this game, The Church in the Darkness, that I've been doing as sort of a micro-sized indie team endeavor. After doing, I've had the range from working on, super big projects on the development team at Ubisoft, working on games like The Suffering in the PS2, Xbox era that were, AAA games for the time, but smaller teams, like 40-person teams or something. And then going to Microsoft, we're working on the giant projects and shipping some really great projects, but working on it as an advisor on the publisher side. For me, it was like, that was really enjoyable, but it's time to get back to making something for me. And then I also, having been through all those big companies and processes and different publishers, wanted to make something that would be, could be a little more risk taking. Something that was still a game that would still appeal to console players and PC players, but maybe didn't have to appeal to all of them, and that you could make something that was more personal a bit, and then also just took on subject matter that not everyone would necessarily like. So
has this been boiling in your mind for years and years where it's like, man, if I ever get a small team, this is the game that I'm going to make?
There had been, the game, I don't know if your, listeners know The Church in the Darkness is the game I've been working on, and it's set in a religious cult in the 1970s, and you're sort of infiltrating it top-down style, sort of like old Metal Gear. I had been thinking, I had various pieces of the inspiration floating around for a while, but it all came together as sort of I started working on it.
It looks like a really interesting game, but looking at screenshots even, I'm still a little bit confused. So you compare it to Metal Gear, looking at screenshots, It's like, is this a simulation? But you're just controlling one character infiltrating this compound.
Right. Yeah, the setup is that there's this religious group that many would call a cult that has moved down to South America in the 1970s to isolate themselves from the evils of America. And you, the player, are an ex-cop who has a nephew who is in the cult group, and the government agencies don't seem to be able to do anything about this, and you don't have great communication with your nephew. So his mother says, hey, could you just try to sneak down there? And you'd lived in South America before, so you're like, yeah, I guess I could try this. I don't think they're not it's not like a walled compound with chain link fence and barbed wire around it or something. You're thinking, yeah, I could probably get in there. Though as you get in there, you start seeing wow, a lot of these guys have guns. That's a bit of a problem. But so the game is really trying to get in and just find your nephew, and then the player's able to decide how they want to do that. So yeah, in terms of the core gameplay, it's mostly it's not about killing everybody you find. You start with a gun, but you've only got, in the current build anyway, we'll probably tune this more before we ship, you only got 8 bullets for it. You can get more bullets, as you take guys down, but it's not about walking into a group of 5 guys and killing them all. Usually if you get in an encounter with 3 guys, you should just run. And it's more about evading detection than it is, or, and you can also play, completely stealthily and avoid detection completely. You can sneak up behind guys and take them out one by one. A couple people at PAXs have actually done that, where they've just murdered everybody in the map. And I'm always like, wow, I'm glad that works, because that's not how I play it.
So Metal Gear Solid.
Yeah, it's open world, but sort of, has that sort of top down, I call it fast paced stealth or infiltration gameplay. So it's not super creep along each corner. It's more keep moving. If someone sees you, just turn and run, and they'll give up on you. And so it's not intended to be too agonizing to play, I guess, in terms of stealth for an extended period like that. But it's also inspired by a game I loved as a kid, which was the original Castle Wolfenstein back on the Apple II. Before Wolfenstein was a shooter.
Yeah.
Listen, Sonny, you may not know about this.
Tell us, Richard.
Before Castle Wolfenstein, before the Wolfenstein 3D that it made, there was a top-down infiltrate a Nazi castle game made by this guy Silas Warner for the Apple II, and then it was ported to Commodore 64 and all those systems.
Yeah.
And it was actually way ahead of its time, because it's kind of like an immersive sim in that you're finding costumes and you're able to bribe guards and stuff, or you can shoot guys one by one if you want to. And the castle regenerates every time you play. Well, it doesn't regenerate every time you play. It regenerates once, and then you can force a new castle to happen. Or while you're playing, if you throw a grenade into a box of grenades, it blows up the castle and forces a new castle on you. So you're sort of learning this map knowledge until you accidentally blow up the very castle you're invading. And then it's nope, sorry, you got a new castle now. So it had a lot of sort of interesting elements in it that were not, used a lot again and obviously Metal Gear, was never a procedurally generated game. but had still that something about that top down perspective I really like for something that's about sneaking in somewhere.
Yeah. So for the Metal Gear fans, just to frame this, it'd be like Metal Gear Solid 5's world, but from Metal Gear Solid 1's perspective. That's the broad pitch here.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And it's not. It does not have the budget of Metal Gear Solid 5. So
I don't think anything does. Yeah.
I don't want people to think it has the feature set of Metal Gear Solid 5 necessarily either, but that sort of core of that gameplay, or I compare it to Hitman as well, like Hitman from a top-down perspective.
Yeah. So what's the riskiest thing about this game? What makes it stand apart as your bold vision?
Yeah, well, I mean, setting it inside, a religious cult, is something. Doing it the way we're doing it, I don't think is something that a lot of publishers would want to take on. Because we're going like they're Christian, they have very strongly held beliefs, and they're also socialist, and they're, ranting about how much they hate the American government. And they're set up as your antagonist because you're trying to go in to find your nephew, but you're actually not sure when you're playing if they're a bunch of crazy apocalyptic religious nuts, or if they're just a bunch of radical sort of progressives, right? Because they espouse a lot of things that someone who's left-leaning would say, yeah, that actually sounds pretty good, because they're like pro-integration, they're anti-Vietnam, they're, they take care of their elderly and all this stuff, and they're railing about, corporations having ruined America and stuff. And, some people can get behind that sort of talk, right? And you're like, and that's the interesting is, well, are these guys good or bad? And in the game, it actually changes every time you play, whether the cult leaders are this sort of dangerous apocalyptic strain, or if they're, just a bunch of radical hippies who want to go live in the jungle.
Wait, you said it changes every time?
Right. So the game has roguelike qualities to it. So it's changes where you start in the map, changes where the objectives are, changes where the loot is, but then also changes the narrative. So you're trying to figure out which version of the cult do I have. And their dogma is the same either time. They're always Christian socialists. They're always railing against the U.S., but sometimes they are, the type of cult that we hear about the most, which is the dangerous type that's often, self-destroying or out to destroy someone else in the end. So sometimes they are that version, and you need to figure that out and get your nephew out of there if that's the case, because something bad will happen if you don't. And then maybe decide what do you want to try to save the rest of the cult or not. Or if you go in, they're just radical progressives, and your nephew's like, I don't want to leave. When you finally find him, then you need to decide, do I trust him? Is it okay this time? I guess. And then, you can choose to leave him there. You can choose to force him to come with you. He may want to come with you and just follow you out. And then you have to get back out of the compound. And you can decide to go try to find the cult leaders themselves and confront them, possibly assassinate them, or, do various different things to them. If you decide you need to do that. But if you decide in the wrong case, if they're just a bunch of guys who want to go do their own thing in the jungle, and you come in and kill the leaders, say, then you're exactly the sort of horrible person from the U.S. they've been railing against, right? So you need to try to not accidentally trap yourself into, being the jerk.
That kind of variety and narrative variety in a roguelike structure is something that's not really done in the industry too much. Were there any examples you look to? Do you feel like this is where you're kind of pioneering something new and experimental?
Yeah, I mean, that's what fascinated me about, the indie scene was the rise of roguelikes. And so many roguelikes, just say, well, we've got a setting, but we don't really have a narrative at all, right? It's just like a setup for things to happen. And that's cool. Like those games I like too. The one I like to look at is Sunless Sea, the Fail Better, Fallen London set game. And obviously that sort of came from a place of interactive fiction originally, because that's what that company does. And they took a lot of that structure and said, what if we made it more about exploration? And what if, maybe we could make it more roguelike like this? And then it felt like it evolved out of them wanting to tell a replayable narrative, but then working roguelike elements into it. And it became this interesting sort of hybrid of the two of them. And there it sort of shifts up, where your objectives are and which quests you're going to get. And, the characters you pick for your crew and stuff like that can change quite a bit. And you're sort of soaking up this narrative, but it doesn't quite do the the main antagonist is different between different playthroughs, and you need to figure that out. That was, another inspiration for that was in the 80s, there was actually a lot of commercial games that experimented with replayability and changing narratives. And there was one called Murder on the Zindernuf, which was a set aboard a blimp and there's been a murder on it. And you need to figure out who it is, but who gets murdered and who did the murdering changes every time. So you need to, it's sort of like playing Clue or something,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
the board game, where, and they just cleverly like figured out how can we set up these different things and then randomize it each time, and then you replay it, and it takes an hour to play through or something, like most games did back then. And that, because it was a shorter playthrough, you could, like, yeah, now I can replay it and solve this different murder this time.
Yeah, I even think of like the Blade Runner game from the 90s, where it's like it changed up, I think, every time, like who's a replicant.
Exactly. All the characters can or cannot be replicants depending on the playthrough. And then you can, like, that game's actually very simulated too. It's like actually running this fairly complex simulation on where the characters are at different times. And you can choose to kill anybody at any point, and the story still continues. And you can get different endings based on, which romantic character you hook up with, and which, whether you're a replicant or not and stuff. And I think there are 40 different endings. There's like 7 core endings and then variants on them where different characters are present or not. Depending on what you did. So, and that was sort of an interesting case to me, because a lot of people didn't realize how interactive the narrative was in that game, and they just played it like a conventional adventure game, and then were like, oh, great, I finished it, and they didn't realize, oh, I should go try again and get a totally different story this time, because they did nothing to message to the audience that it was happening. There was no bars telling you that. There was no, like, she will remember that, or something that you might see in The Walking Dead. So they didn't, I think you do, as we're evolving interactive narratives, you kind of need to over communicate to the player a little bit what's going on, so that, either there's like, I thought when the Telltale game said, this game will react to what you do and will change every time you play, whatever that message is at the beginning of the game is a really smart move to just make sure, like, no, this is not what you're used to. So
that's
be
true.
careful what you do, right?
Yeah, for sure. So it's interesting hearing you saying, like, wanted to tackle the focus of this religious cult and trying to invade them and take it out or save it. And then the announcement of Far Cry 5 recently.
Yes. What's that game? I've never heard of it.
Yeah, it's a little game. I don't know. It's from this company called Ubisoft. You might be familiar with.
Right. Oh, them. I know them.
What is your take on a company as big as Ubisoft going for something as controversial as taking down a religious cult?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the peril of being an indie developer who announced his game a year ago, that in the time since you announced it, someone else might realize, hey, we could do something like that. And I suspect, though, in that case, that they started development before we announced. But yeah, I am a fan of Far Cry games. I played a little bit of 1, but I like 2 a lot, as everybody who's an arty indie developer does. and but I also like 3. I'm the guy who liked both of them, right? And I just feel they're like totally different experiences, right?
Yeah.
1 is just like a funhouse ride with crazy characters, and then 1's this like dark meditation on mortality. So I like those games, certainly over 3 and 4, and Blood Dragon. I haven't played Primal at all. They've shown that the brand of that game is this sort of very campy, over the top sort of settings, and then just letting the player do whatever they want to do, slaughter some exotic animals for their wallets and whatnot. And that's a lot of fun when you're playing those games, but it can be, I think, hard to tackle serious subject matter while having that sort of funhouse ride quality to it at the same time. So I'll be really interested to see what they do with, the type of subject matter they're obviously trying to tackle in the new game. And I think if I had to guess based on what they've shown, and I had no foreknowledge of that game at all, based on what they've shown and what that brand is of Far Cry, it's going to be more campy and over the top than what I'm going for.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly has drummed up a certain amount of controversy already. And I'm curious what you think about a company like Ubisoft being willing to wade into somewhat controversial waters. I think Ubisoft gets a lot of crap, maybe fairly, for, oh, great, another AC game. Okay, climbing a tower, unlocking part of the map, we've done it again. But they are an interesting company that takes some bizarre risks that maybe people don't give credit for. Even, some of the quirkier Rayman stuff, or Valiant Hearts, or World War I game out of France. But what do you think about a company that big, embracing controversy like that?
Well, I mean, even if you look at Assassin's Creed that you mentioned, that's been doing stories about Templars and who are the real villains here, and, have suggested certain presidents, I believe, are Templars or not, right?
Yeah, I think Bush is a Templar, yeah.
Right, yeah, so I think they have waded into these controversial waters before. It was just a little more the background story than the A story, right? And
Right.
obviously with Far Cry 5, it's more like, here you go. And that was something we were dealing with on Rainbow Six Patriots too, is that was set in, you were dealing with homegrown American terrorists in that game. And that was not something Ubisoft wanted to do at that time. And apparently they have changed their mind to be a little more open to that sort of thing. Because I remember looking at, as the Far Cry 5 reveal came out, I was like, oh, it's like the true Patriots, huh? Interesting. And obviously they're different, right? And that they've got, they're in Montana and they're a little more, religious. Like the true Patriots weren't religious at all. And it's unclear to me how religious these people are. Like they're sort of doing, like in the trailer, they've got like a forced baptism and stuff, but they're not like quoting Bible scripture either.
Yeah, I wonder if they'll always just flirt with that edge of it's not quite Christianity.
I think they're not Christian. Because I think they're like, let's not make the enemies Christian. That would be going too far. But I don't know. They might be. It's hard to say. I did notice in one of the other side characters they revealed was the ally of yours who's a Christian preacher, right? Who's out to defend his church. And they're like, so I think they're probably saying, look at him. No, we don't. This is not an anti-religion game.
Right.
Covering the bets. I don't know. This is all just me imagining what they might be doing.
Totally. Well, what's it like to be on the inside of a company that's courting controversial stuff like that? I mean, based on your experience with Rainbow Six Patriots, is it just me and PR is always going to be really on edge with every interview you do? Or what is it like to be in the center of that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to remember. It was a ways back. I had really good experiences with smaller company farther in the past, like with the Suffering game. That was Midway publishing it. Midway is the Mortal Kombat company, right? So, in the Suffering, we were doing like a lot of gore and language stuff that hadn't been done before. And they were just game for it. They were just like, all right, let's go. Let's be the first company to use this swear word and stuff. We pioneered being set in a prison. It felt more plausible than other games. But then also, we did heavy subject matter in that game. Like there was a wrecked slave ship on the beach, and there was this. And I was always pretty sensitive to, how's this going to look if, we don't want to make it look like we're exploiting the situation, but explore it seriously. And, the executives I worked with at Midway were very like, I'm glad you're thinking this through, so that we're not just, setting the place on fire. But they were happy to just, do crazy stuff in other games. So they were just very open to it, and it wasn't much of a problem. There was never like a media concern about don't say the wrong thing about this. At Ubisoft, there was a little more, I don't know. I felt like they trusted us to talk pretty seriously about the subject matter. And, you would work out more carefully with the PR team or what exactly are we going to talk about at this event or that event, which is something, anybody should do because you don't want to like give away all of your game, just like from a spoiler standpoint either, right? And maybe you want to like release something right before you launch to like drum up some interest. So it was more on that. And there was, I think it helped that, they're a French company, so they're a little less gun shy about courting controversy, I think, in the first point. And then we were up in Montreal, but then, myself and the creative director were also Americans and we were dealing with American subject matter. So they felt like we had a pretty good handle on it. And there were times when some of the other team members would go much farther with the concepts than we would, like people who were Quebecois or French. And I don't want to, stigmatize them based on that, but they were just less attuned to like how an American would react to something like that.
Right.
Like you should imagine if there was like a subplot about 9/11 worked into the game or something, and you've probably seen like conspiracy theories about that out on the net. You could see how someone else might bring that. And it's like, oh, this is just this goofy piece of fiction we can put in here. I'm like, no. My brother was in New York on 9/11. This is not, we cannot do that, or whatever it is. So it was more, sometimes it was us pulling back from some of the more out there ideas in that case. But I think, every company, has a different level of conservatism to it, like every publisher. And, would EA or someone like that publish Assassin's Creed with all of the sort of subversive stuff? It doesn't seem like it fits Ubisoft's identity, obviously. But
right. I mean, every company touches it every once in a while. Like, was it Medal of Honor, one of the more recent ones where you started out in multiplayer, you could play as the Taliban, I believe, from EA's point of view, but even that's just a murky thing. I think they even backpedaled on it eventually. But
was that Medal of Honor game?
It was
doing that at one point.
Yeah. But with Rainbow Six Patriots, I went back and watched some of the interviews that we did back in the day were very dry. I feel like I should have done a better job at filming and editing those, but you did a great job on camera. But it was interesting just hearing you and David Sears, the creative director, talking, and you both were bracing for like, well, I'm sure when the game comes out, we're going to be brought on Fox News. We're going to have to do interviews about this.
Right.
And were you just bracing for that rough but interesting finish line that just never came?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think David and I were both like, felt strongly enough that we were treating the material seriously and being thoughtful about it, that we were going to be able to defend it. You know, it wasn't like we were just trying to exploit, you know, the situation to like get some laughs or get some cool new enemies to shoot or something like that. It was just designed to make it more thoughtful. So I think we were both ready to defend it as necessary. And even with the amount of coverage we did, InfoWars actually did a story on it back then. InfoWars is more known now as they've sort of risen in prominence with the current administration. But back then they covered it as being some, you know, horrible thing that shouldn't exist. And that was interesting to see. But yeah, they weren't getting anybody to interview on their show. That's not really their shtick. So yeah, no, we were ready to do it, but also felt strongly enough about the subject matter being good and thoughtful and just a new take on, like, you know, we're tired of shooting the same enemies all the time. And there are scary people over here too.
Let's put some weight behind it. Yeah. So I think from the outside perspective, it's seen as a controversial topic. Is it as simple as that is ultimately what brought that project down? Or what do you see as the nail in the coffin?
I would not be able to articulate what exactly happened there, you know, in terms of why it didn't happen. Those were certainly not how those decisions were made. Was not something I was privy to. I was just suddenly aware we weren't doing it anymore.
What's it like to be on the inside when you feel a project start to crumble? Is it as easy as everything's going along swimmingly and then you're called into a conference room and said, maybe not? Or do you feel it start to decay?
It can definitely go that way sometimes. Sometimes, you know, and when you realize, well, I just spent a year and a half of my life on something that's not going to come out. And that's just a bummer creatively, right? That particularly if you're highly invested in it, it's just like, oh, well, that's gone. Man, I could have been doing something else. So there's that frustrating side of it. But sometimes you can look back and see the warning signs of like, oh, I remember that meeting where they said this, and then we said, no, it's fine, or whatever. We should have dived in and talked about that more then, and we could have saved everyone a lot of trouble. So I tend to, after something like that happens, look back and say, where were the warning signs about it? There, I didn't see them though. So I couldn't tell you what exactly happened there.
I heard, and tell me if this is just completely off base, but I was talking to somebody once about it and they worked on it and they're like, you know, I think it's just as simple as Call of Duty was a tough thing for the Rainbow Six brand to deal with. And trying to figure out how much do we court that audience? How much do we stay true to the Rainbow Six brand? I mean, is that just a wild oversimplification? How much truth do you think there is to that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly while we were working on it, there was a lot of talk of let's just go after Call of Duty. And, you know, where this is the Ubisoft shooter franchise that could do it. Right?
Yeah.
And we still have our points of differentiation, but let's make sure it, you know, appeals to a more straight ahead audience. And I think the earlier Rainbow Six games had been more accommodating of a console audience, and they'd had like pull out third person cameras and stuff that they thought, you know, would help make it more playable for that audience. And if you look at, you know, I haven't actually played Siege, but my impression of it is that it's gone back to earlier Rainbow Six in terms of tactical planning and bigger, you know, spaces that you can assault from any direction. And they sort of, I think the market changed, you know, under it in a little bit. And I don't know if this was the reason or not, but looking at it from the outside, I could see how everyone was thinking we should make our own Call of Duty now. And then people are like, no, we need to make something that's more different than Call of Duty, or that's a more complex experience, or just takes a much more different tact on it. And as games move to a lot more, you know, multiplayer only games, as Siege turned out to be, you know, it became clear that you could make a game that would do that. And, you know, from the whole time, most of the time, I guess I was working on it, the multiplayer was always fun and was always like, this is in good shape. We like this, and we can do this and this, and then we have all these ideas for it. And that was great. And ultimately they just doubled down on that stuff. And then added, you know, it changed radically after I left. So, I think they realized, hey, we could make something that's more like a live game experience versus like, you play a 10-hour campaign once and then don't look at it again.
It's interesting. You say you didn't play Siege. Is it just, do you think it's too painful? Do you just not have interest? What's the emotion there?
Yeah, I think it's mostly the fact that I'm an indie developer and don't have time to sink into multiplayer shooters.
You haven't even played Battlegrounds yet. Come on, Richard.
I know. That one's still like, that's been out like, that feels like that's been a couple months of that being the hot thing, right?
Yeah.
So there's still time for it to be a flavor of the month. And then everyone's like, oh, remember when we were into Battlegrounds so much? Yeah, no, what game? I don't even remember what you're talking about. Now we're playing,
Battlefront 2.
Battle World or something, right? Anyway, so we'll see about that one, though. That game looks awesome from what I've seen of it. Yeah, for Siege, it was just, bad timing in terms of I'm not working on that type of game. And as an indie developer, I work constantly. And I've also got like kids and they're not going to play Rainbow Six Siege. So, when I play other games, it's more like Super Mario Maker or something like that is more like a wholesome experience for the whole family. And then I play games like Hitman or Dishonored or something that's more like in the wheelhouse of what I'm doing. And plus, you can just get in and play that for 30 minutes and feel good. Whereas it always feels like with multiplayer experiences, it's like, now I got to sink in some time to not be embarrassed in these matches, right? So
going back to the beginning of the conversation with that 25% for Rainbow Six Patriots that's boiling within you, I mean, is it frustration? Is it guilt, regret? Do you ever just wake up in the middle of the night and think, God, if we just would have done this, we could have pulled that ship into harbor? Yeah, I don't look at the past that way very often, I guess. Like I look at it analytically to think, what would I do differently next time? But not in a specific, like in this one case, if this one thing had happened, something else would have happened here. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I don't know that, and I'm still sort of murky on what the ultimate reasons were for it. So yeah, I don't have a good answer for that one.
Other than the lesson of, have those tougher conversations early. Don't put it off.
But even there were so few warning signs lit.
Yeah.
I don't know. Like I've seen other projects go wrong and not come out where I'm like, yeah, I was always like when I worked on a Western game a long time ago, long before Red Dead Redemption. And I think the studio head and I just saw different games, right?
Yeah.
And that's the sort of thing where you're like, oh, I convinced him, but I didn't, you kind of got to get the key players at least on the same page about what exactly you're making, and there've been other projects like that too, where it's like, I think I love this thing, but this guy who's an important boss of mine doesn't like it, but it's okay, it'll work out. Yeah, usually not. So you need to like come to the version of the game where everybody is really into what you're making, or it's just going to be too much of an uphill battle to get it done.
Yeah. It's interesting. Tell me if I'm drawing too much of a line directly from Rainbow Six Patriots to Church in the Darkness. Do you feel like you learned how to court controversy and now you're embracing it to try and push the industry forward? Is there any direct link between those two experiences?
Well, I mean, I think there was, a frustration of working on something I believed in and then not getting to make it that led me to think, as an indie, you're your own boss, right? You don't have to deal with, trying to convince various factions that this is a good idea. Like I still have to convince the public it's a good idea, or convince the press that it's a good idea, or convince, the team that we're, going in a certain direction with stuff. But it's just fewer layers, right? Of like, because sometimes there can be like 18 layers of people you feel like you need to convince just to keep going forward with something. And that's where, when you're working on a game that costs $50 to $100 million to make, they're right to be asking those questions, right? They're right to be saying, who's this going to piss off? What will that do to X, Y, and Z about, our ability to finish this, or our ability to sell this in Walmart or whatever they're doing, or not get it banned from Steam or something like that, right? So that's not much of a concern. So it's right that these people are having these questions when you're spending that much money. So I think if you want to do something that's more out there and weird, it's only appropriate you spend less money making it and just try to make it the best thing you can. And that's sort of, I'm a fan of a lot of, indie films and obscure metal bands and stuff that are not doing these big elaborate things, but they're just doing something that's very personal to them and making it work at like a smaller scale financially, but still making it an amazing experience for people who want to turn out for that. So it just seemed like for this type of subject matter and want to do the things, because there are like a number of risks with this project. There's both the setting and the narrative. But then there's also like the mechanics of like a replayable narrative, and the way we're doing it hasn't really been done before. And it's like, that's too many risks already for something that costs a ton of money and has to sell 10 million copies. So if we can just sell 100,000 copies, I'll be ecstatic. And obviously if it sells more than that, that'll be fantastic too. But it'll be great because it'll be, the thing I wanted to do this time. Who knows, in the future, I may want to, go work on bigger projects again. There's certainly lots of benefits to them, and working with those great teams of many different people who have different skills, and that can be a lot of fun too. But for this one, it felt like, let's just keep it focused, smaller, do exactly what I want to do on this.
Yeah, for sure. Well, hey, congratulations on chasing your dream, man.
Yeah.
Best of luck wrapping it up.
Cool. Yeah. No, we're working on that right now.
You have
I should be working on it right now.
Sorry for keeping this interview so long. What do you have a rough time frame in mind?
What's that?
Do you have a rough time frame in mind for when Church in the Darkness is coming out?
Yeah, no, we announced 2017, and we're still working hard on that. So we haven't announced an official date though.
Okay, sometime relatively soon.
Yes.
Okay.
Not forever from now, but in indie world, there's a different sense of time sometimes.
Definitely. There's before Far Cry 5 and after Far Cry 5. Got it. It's the ultimate benchmark. Well, hey, best of luck wrapping it up. Thank you so much for joining us, man.
Cool, man. It's great to talk to you.
Thank you so much for watching this excerpt from the Game Informer Show podcast. You can subscribe to the audio version and listen to new episodes airing every Thursday. We cover big games on the horizon, games that we've just reviewed. We have long-form developer interviews, a lot of fun stuff. So check it out every Thursday.